The first time my father tried to break me, he didn't use words. He didn't use a belt. He didn't even use his fists. He lifted a solid oak chair above his head and smashed it across my back with such force that the crack of wood and bone echoed together like a gunshot through our house. Pain exploded so violently, I thought my spine had snapped in two. The breath ripped from my lungs as I collapsed to the floor, gasping like a fish dragged from water. My cheek pressed into the carpet fibers as blood filled my mouth, and my father's shadow loomed over me, his voice thundering. "This will teach you manners." That was not discipline. That was annihilation. And as I lay, trembling, ribs screaming with every shallow breath, I understood for the first time that my father's love had never been love at all. It was control, pure and merciless. My name is Laura Bennett, and this is the story of how my father's rage shaped my body into evidence, and my silence into chains, until years later, an MRI revealed the truth he spent a lifetime trying to hide. To the outside world, Edward Bennett was a pillar of respect, the kind of man people trusted without question. He was the one who carried hymnals into church on Sunday mornings, the man who volunteered to fix a neighbor's porch, the husband who stood tall with a smile in every community photograph. Neighbors praised him as disciplined, hard-working, God-fearing, the very image of stability. But behind the white shutters of our neat two-story home, he ruled with fists, commands, and the constant threat of pain. He believed that bruises were lessons and obedience was the only form of respect worth giving. My mother, Patricia, helped him maintain that illusion. She never lifted a hand against me, but her words cut deeper than any blow. "Your father only does this because he loves you," she would say as she dabbed a rag against my swelling cheek. "He wants to make sure you grow up right." What she meant was that his reputation mattered more than my body. Her silence was loyalty, and her loyalty was betrayal. My older brother Christopher chose a different kind of betrayal retreat. He was 3 years older already, preparing to escape to college, and he decided the only way to survive was to keep his head down and his mouth shut. He saw my bruises, he heard the yelling, he watched the chair crash down, but he kept his eyes lowered because speaking up meant sharing my punishment. In his silence, I saw my future unless I found a way out. To everyone else, we were the perfect family. My father polished his truck until it gleamed. My mother baked pies for the church fair. My brother's grades kept teachers proud and neighbors nodding approval. And me, I learned to smile through pain, to pull down my sleeves, to move carefully so no one noticed the limp. People would wave at us and say, "What a fine family," and I would wave back while wondering how they couldn't see the fractures beneath the surface. Meals were the stage for his authority. We sat around that long wooden table, each bite measured, each glance monitored. If I chewed too loudly, his hand would slam against the table. If I spoke out of turn, his eyes would narrow. Punishment never came right there. It was worse than that. It came later behind closed doors, sudden, unpredictable. A slap, a shove, hours kneeling on rice until my knees bled. And always the sermon afterward. Respect Laura. Respect your father, respect your family, respect what I do for you. Respect was just another word for fear. I grew up believing pain was the only teacher, that scars were a kind of textbook written into my skin. But somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "This is not love." I buried it to survive, but it never stopped whispering. The night of the chair was the moment survival changed into resolve. Unlike the bruises on my arms or the welts across my legs, this wound could not be hidden. My body screamed with every movement. My mother wrung her hands and said, "Laura, don't provoke him," as if breathing too loudly was provocation. My brother stared at me, guilt flickering in his eyes before he looked away. My father stood above me, chest heaving, satisfied, convinced he had bent me into obedience. But what he really did that night was light a fuse. Because the body remembers. Bones remember. Years later, a machine would scan my spine and reveal the truth carved into me, fracture, scar tissue damage that could never be explained away as clumsiness or bad luck. That MRI would expose my father not as a strict man, but as a destroyer. And when the truth came, it would tear down everything he built his reputation on. But at 15, lying on the floor gasping for air, I didn't know how justice would come. All I knew was this: if I didn't fight smart, if I didn't learn patience, one day he would finish what he started with that chair. And I refused to let Edward Bennett write the end of my story. To understand how my father kept his violence hidden for so long, you need to see the web. He spun a web made of fear, lies, and control so tight that even I sometimes doubted my own memories. Edward Bennett didn't shout in public. He didn't strike me where teachers could see he didn't leave marks on my face before church. He was methodical, deliberate, a craftsman of cruelty who knew how to preserve his reputation while breaking me down piece by piece. At school, I looked like any other teenager. Maybe a little quiet, maybe a little too careful, but no one suspected the truth because he played the role of the devoted father so perfectly. He would come to my school events and clap louder than anyone else, pat my shoulder with that heavy hand that felt like both a warning and a performance, smiling wide for the other parents. And when neighbors praised him, my mother would beam as if she too believed the illusion. At home, the mask came off. The house was his kingdom, every room his throne. He decided what we wore when we ate, how we spoke. I learned early that asking questions was dangerous. If I asked why Christopher could go out with friends and I couldn't, his voice would harden. Because you're not him. If I asked why he hit me, he would say, because you need it. Every answer was final. Every rule, absolute. My mother enforced his narrative, repeating his phrases until I could barely distinguish her voice from his. Don't upset your father. He's just teaching you discipline. You'll thank him one day. Her eyes looked tired when she said it, but her tone left no room for argument. To her, keeping peace meant keeping him satisfied, and keeping him satisfied meant sacrificing me. Meals became rituals of tension. If I placed my fork down too quickly, his eyes would flicker like storm clouds. If I looked away while he was speaking, his jaw would tighten. Punishment wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Hours later, he would summon me to the living room, demand that I kneel on the floorboards, his voice echoing with self-righteousness. Sometimes he made me hold my arms out until they ached. Sometimes he used a belt, sometimes his open hand, but always with the same justification: respect. That word twisted inside me like poison. To him, respect meant obedience without thought, silence without question, pain without protest. Christopher withdrew further each year, retreating into books, into friends' houses, into any corner of existence that didn't involve confrontation. He knew that standing up for me would mean sharing my punishment, and he wasn't willing to risk it. I don't blame him entirely. He was a victim too, but his silence wrapped around me like another set of chains. By the time I was 15, I understood that no one in my family would save me. My father was too powerful, my mother too complicit, my brother too afraid. And so the lies flourished. To neighbors, we were the perfect family. They saw Edward mow the lawn, wave at passers-by, lead prayers on Sunday, and they believed what they wanted to believe. Who would suspect the man who organized community barbecues of smashing a chair across his daughter's back? Who would question the bruises when Patricia smiled so sweetly and insisted, "Laura's just clumsy, she fell off her bike again"? The deception wasn't just external, it was internal. He convinced me that I was at fault, that I provoked his rage, that I deserved every bruise. He was a master of gaslighting, twisting reality until I questioned my own memory. Did that really happen? I'd ask myself, staring at the mirror at night, tracing the outline of a welt on my shoulder. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I shouldn't have talked back. He planted doubt so deep that it grew roots. The deeper truth, though, was that he enjoyed it. I saw it in his eyes after he struck me, that flicker of satisfaction, the curve of a smile quickly hidden. He believed he was untouchable, shielded by reputation, church, and fear. And in many ways he was, because no matter how loud I cried, no matter how much I hurt the walls of that house, swallowed my pain, and the world outside applauded his virtue, that duality broke something in me. It's one thing to be hurt. It's another to be hurt and told it never happened. By then, my body was already carrying secret injuries, aches in my back, stabbing pains when I breathed too deep, but I didn't dare complain. Complaints invited accusations, accusations invited punishment. So I learned to swallow pain like medicine, bitter and burning, waiting for the day I could spit it back out. The web he wove wasn't just about control, it was about erasing truth itself. And for years it worked. The night everything shifted began like so many others, with my father pacing the living room while I finished my homework at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning for some small imperfection to ignite his temper. It didn't take long. He saw a textbook left slightly ajar, a pencil rolling toward the edge, and in his mind, those tiny details were proof of my rebellion. "You never learn, Laura," he growled, and before I could respond, his hand clamped around the back of a chair. Lifting it with terrifying ease, and in a single motion, he swung it into my back. The impact knocked me forward, my forehead striking the table stars, bursting across my vision as the chair shattered against me. His words followed searing into my memory. "This will teach you manners." My mother gasped but did nothing, her hands fluttering in useless panic. Christopher froze, eyes wide, then dropped his gaze to the floor, too afraid to interfere. I tried to rise, but my body refused my spine, screaming my chest tight with every breath. For a moment, I thought he had killed me. That night was different, not just because of the violence, but because of what lingered afterward. I couldn't move normally the next day. Each step stabbed, each breath burned. My mother insisted I was exaggerating, that I should stop being dramatic, but even she noticed the way I winced whenever I reached for something. Weeks turned into months, and the pain never left. Teachers began to ask questions. My physical education teacher, Ms. Angela Foster, saw how I stumbled during running drills, how I pressed a hand against my lower back and grimaced. She pulled me aside after class, her voice soft but insistent. "Laura, has someone hurt you?" I shook my head, terrified of what would happen if I admitted the truth, but she wasn't fooled. "I think you need to see a doctor," she said, and she wasn't asking, she was telling. That moment planted a seed. My father's beatings were no longer invisible. Someone else had noticed. When I finally ended up in Dr. Samuel Price's office after another dizzying wave of pain sent me collapsing in the hallway, I knew this was my chance. He examined me with a frown, ordered an MRI, and when the results came back, I saw the shift in his eyes, the mixture of anger and sadness that told me the truth was finally undeniable. "Laura," he said carefully, "these injuries didn't happen yesterday or even last month. They're years old. You have multiple fractures that healed badly, scar tissue signs of repeated trauma. Someone has been hurting you for a very long time." His words cracked the dam I had built inside myself. For the first time in years, I felt validation, proof that I wasn't crazy, that the pain wasn't weakness or imagination. It was real, carved into my bones. He asked me directly if my father had done this. I opened my mouth, but fear strangled my answer. Still, the images on the scans spoke for me. They were evidence no excuse could erase. The world finally had something it couldn't ignore. When I left his office clutching those papers, I knew everything had changed. The web of deception my father spun was fraying, and soon it would collapse. He had built his reputation on control and silence, but the MRI had given me a voice louder than his fists could ever be, and deep down I realized, trembling but certain that my fight for freedom had truly begun. After the MRI revealed what my father had carved into my body over the years, something inside me shifted from helplessness to calculation. For 15 years, I had endured believing survival meant silence, but now I understood survival required strategy. I could not confront him head-on, not yet, because Edward Bennett thrived on intimidation and raw power, and in his house I was still outmatched. But I had something new, something he could not erase with his fists proof. Dr. Price's words echoed in my head. These injuries are years old, and I knew one day those words would shatter the mask my father wore in public. I began to play a different role no longer. Just the obedient daughter, but the quiet observer, the collector of moments, the recorder of truth. I wrote in hidden notebooks describing every slap, every kick, every bruise, even the exact words he used. "Respect is earned through pain," he would say, as if quoting scripture, and I would jot it down later in cramped handwriting, evidence disguised as teenage scribbles. My mother continued her gaslighting, telling me not to provoke him, insisting that he acted out of love, but even she began to falter when my back pain grew too obvious. She would press a heating pad against me, whispering apologies she would never say in front of him, her loyalty torn between her husband and her daughter. Christopher drifted further into silence, preparing for college, leaving me behind in a house where every creak of floorboards made my stomach knot. Still, I waited. I waited and I planned. I studied my father's patterns. I noticed that his anger always flared when control slipped when he felt challenged. I realized that if I appeared compliant, if I played the dutiful daughter, his guard would lower. And when his guard was down, I could move pieces into place. Ms. Foster became an ally without even knowing it. Her concern lingered, her eyes following me during gym, her voice encouraging me to stand tall, to trust myself. She gave me hope that not every adult would side with him, that the world outside our white-shuttered house might believe me if I ever dared to speak. At night, lying awake on a mattress that creaked under my bruised body, I replayed scenarios, imagined escape routes, considered who I could trust. Fear kept me silent, but strategy kept me alive. I told myself over and over, wait, collect, prepare. My father had spent years teaching me patience in the cruelest ways, forcing me to kneel for hours, punishing me for speaking too soon, and ironically, that same enforced patience became my weapon. I would endure, but I would also remember. I would store away every injury, every cruel word, every humiliation, and one day I would let it all out, not as a scream, not as a cry, but as undeniable truth that would destroy his image. The MRI was the first crack in his armor, but I knew more would come if I was careful. He thought he had silenced me, but he had only taught me how to listen, how to bide my time, how to wait for the moment when justice could no longer be denied. And so I carried his lessons differently now, not as obedience, but as preparation, because I knew the day was coming when Edward Bennett would face the weight of his own violence, and I would be the one to make sure the world saw him for who he truly was. By the time I turned 18, the patience my father had beaten into me had hardened into something sharper, something dangerous for him. I was no longer the trembling girl on the carpet. I was a young woman carrying evidence in my bones and in my notebooks, and I was ready to use both. College gave me the first real distance from Edward Bennett's shadow, but his control lingered in my body, a constant throb in my back that reminded me he was never truly gone. It was that pain, that unrelenting ache that drove me back to Dr. Price for another scan after a dizzy spell left me collapsed on the dorm hallway floor. When the new MRI lit up on the screen, the doctor didn't hide his alarm. "Laura, these injuries are extensive. This isn't a one-time accident. This is the result of years of repeated trauma." His voice was quiet, but the truth was thunderous. He knew, and now I knew, that I had more than scars. I had proof. Proof that could not be explained away as clumsiness or bad luck. Proof that would expose my father's reign of terror. Holding those films in my hands, I felt a power I had never known before. The trap began to take shape in my mind. I contacted Ms. Foster, who was no longer just a teacher, but someone I trusted. I showed her the scans, the doctor's notes, and pieces of the journals I had hidden since I was 15. She read silently, her eyes wide, her hands trembling, and when she finally looked at me, her voice was steady. "Laura, this is evidence. He cannot deny this." That was when I understood my father had trained me to wait, and now the waiting was over. I gathered witnesses quietly. I reached out to a close friend who remembered the times I limped into class, to a neighbor who once heard shouting through our walls, to anyone who had seen even a glimpse of what went on behind our closed doors. Slowly, a picture began to form, not just in my journals, but in the eyes of others. And still, I kept silent at home, visiting on weekends, smiling through clenched teeth, letting him believe I was still under his command. He would lecture me at the dinner table about respect and obedience, unaware that every word was fuel for his downfall. The trap was patience. The trap was silence, turned into record. The trap was letting him play his role while I prepared the stage where he would be stripped of it forever. With every doctor's note, every entry in my journal, every person who agreed to stand by me, the net tightened. My father believed he had erased the truth, but I was weaving it back together stronger than ever. And as I stacked the evidence, I knew that when the moment came to confront him, there would be no escape, no denial, no mask strong enough to survive the weight of the scars he had left on me. The trap was set, and the man who thought he controlled everything was already caught. He just didn't know it yet. The day of reckoning came not with fists or screams, but with paper scans and words that cut deeper than any blow my father had ever delivered. I had chosen the moment carefully, a family gathering in our living room, where Edward Bennett sat in his armchair like a king. Patricia hovered nearby, wringing her hands, and Christopher leaned against the wall, avoiding eye contact. I placed a folder on the table, my hands steady even as my heart hammered, and when my father sneered and asked what childish stunt I was pulling, I opened it and spread the contents for everyone to see. MRI images glowing with evidence of fractures that had healed badly, doctor's notes detailing repeated trauma, my journals chronicling the nights of pain and the exact words he spat at me. "Respect is earned through pain. This will teach you manners." For a moment, silence hung heavy, and then my father's face turned red with fury. "She's lying," he roared, pointing at me as if he could will everyone to believe him. "She's always been dramatic, always trying to make me look bad." But the scans were undeniable. Dr. Price himself stepped forward, a man whose authority my father could not easily dismiss. "These injuries span years," he said calmly, "and they are consistent with repeated physical abuse. This is not a child exaggerating, Mr. Bennett. This is medical fact." My mother burst into tears, torn between fear of him and the reality laid bare before her. "Edward, what have you done?" she whispered, though I noticed she still couldn't bring herself to stand beside me fully. Christopher looked at the papers at me, then at our father, and for the first time in years, he didn't look away. He met my eyes and nodded just once, a silent acknowledgement that he knew it was true, that he always knew. My father lunged to snatch the papers, but I pulled them back, my voice sharper than I ever thought possible. "You cannot hit this away. You cannot scream this away. You cannot hide behind sermons or church or mother's excuses. These scars are carved into me, and they are proof of everything you've done." His mouth opened to unleash more rage, but the room had shifted. The mask he had worn for decades cracked in front of the people who once believed him unquestioningly. Patricia's sobs were no longer cover, they were confession. Christopher's silence was no longer protection, it was condemnation. And Dr. Price's presence was judgment, impartial and final. My father roared again, words spilling about respect, about discipline, about how children needed a strong hand, but every sentence only proved his guilt further. "Love doesn't leave scars," I said, my voice shaking yet unbreakable, and the words cut through his tirade like a blade. In that moment, I saw fear flicker in his eyes, fear not of me, but of the truth of the collapse of the image he had built so carefully. He realized then that the power had shifted, that the girl he tried to crush with a chair had grown into the woman who could destroy him with evidence. That night, the reckoning began, and though he stormed out of the room vowing vengeance, his world was already crumbling, and he knew it. Once the truth was spoken aloud and the evidence laid bare, it spread like cracks through glass, unstoppable and irreversible. My father had built his image on discipline and respect, but overnight, that image began to collapse. Dr. Price filed his report with the authorities, attaching the MRI scans and medical notes, and suddenly, Edward Bennett, the man who once stood at the pulpit teaching lessons about morality, was under investigation for child abuse. Word traveled quickly in our small town. Neighbors who once praised his devotion now whispered about the bruises they had pretended not to notice the nights they heard shouting through our walls, the way I always seemed to move stiffly as though carrying invisible weight. My mother tried to defend him at first, her voice trembling as she told friends I was exaggerating, but the evidence silenced her. When the images appeared in official hands, even she could no longer spin excuses. Christopher admitted quietly to investigators that he had seen my father strike me countless times, and though guilt filled his voice, his testimony became another piece in the puzzle. One by one, the dominoes fell. My father was suspended from his role at the church, the very community he had manipulated turning cold. His friends avoided him. His colleagues refused to shake his hand, and the same people who once called him a pillar now muttered abuser under their breath. For the first time, I watched him shrink, no longer towering, but cornered, stripped of the armor of reputation. At home, tension turned toxic. Patricia alternated between tears and silence, her denial cracking as she realized the man she defended was destroying her as well. Christopher moved out completely unwilling to breathe the same air, leaving me with the fragments of a family that had never truly been whole. My father stormed around the house, slamming doors, shouting about betrayal, but the louder he raged, the clearer it became he had lost control. The very word he had used as a weapon, respect, was gone, dissolved in the weight of evidence, whispers, and judgment. The authorities pressed forward, their questions precise, their tone firm. How long has this been happening? How many times did he strike you? Did he ever use objects? My answers were steady, supported by the scans that spoke louder than any testimony. Each detail tightened the noose, and each time I spoke the truth, I felt stronger. Edward tried to intimidate me with glares, with muttered threats under his breath, but for the first time, his power didn't reach me. The domino effect wasn't just external, it was internal. The fear that once froze my tongue was unraveling, replaced by something fiercer. I no longer flinched when his voice rose. I no longer doubted myself when my mother whispered excuses. The lies were collapsing, and with every fallen lie, I stood taller. The man who smashed a chair across my back, believing he would break me, had instead set into motion the collapse of his own empire. His reign was ending not with silence but with exposure, and every passing day brought another consequence he could not outrun. When the walls of my father's power finally began to crumble, I walked away from the ruins and built something new, piece by piece. Moving out of that house felt like shedding a second skin, one made of bruises, lies, and fear, and for the first time, I breathed air that did not taste like control. College became not just an education, but a refuge, a place where I could choose my own clothes without scrutiny, eat meals without inspection, and speak without waiting for permission. Yet the damage lingered. My back ached, every morning scars invisible to the eye, but carved deep into muscle and bone, a constant reminder of what I had survived. Therapy became a lifeline. Sitting across from a counselor who listened without judgment, I poured out years of silence, and in the listening, I discovered something shocking: that my story had value, that my pain was not just mine, but a warning and a comfort to others who had endured similar shadows. Slowly, I joined support groups, first as a trembling participant, then as a voice others turned toward. Each time I spoke, the words grew steadier. My father hurt me, my mother defended him, my brother stayed silent, but I survived. And with each repetition, the shame that had once strangled me dissolved a little more. Patricia remained trapped in her cycle, living alone in the house that had once been our prison, haunted by the collapse of her husband's reputation. Christopher rebuilt his life elsewhere, still carrying guilt, but at last acknowledging the truth. Edward himself faced charges, his name etched into public records, not as a leader, but as an abuser, his kingdom of respect reduced to whispers and scorn. I did not rejoice at his downfall the way I once imagined I might. Instead, I felt a heavy peace, the kind that comes not from vengeance, but from the certainty that he could never hurt me again. My new foundation was not built on fear, but on choice. I chose who to trust. I chose who to keep in my circle. And most of all, I chose never to remain silent when silence protected cruelty. The girl who once gasped for air beneath the weight of a chair had become a woman who could stand straight even if her back still carried scars. And as I stood taller, I realized something profound. I was not broken. I was forged. 2 years after the night I laid those MRI scans on the table, the name Edward Bennett no longer commanded respect, but carried the sting of disgrace. The man who once strutted through church aisles as a model father now shuffled into courtrooms with shoulders hunched and eyes darting, his sermons of discipline silenced by testimony and evidence that stripped him bare. The trial was not dramatic in the way movies portray, but for me, every detail carried the weight of years. Dr. Price explained the scans in clear language, showing the jury lines of old fractures and scar tissue that could not be dismissed as accidents. Ms. Foster recounted the way she had seen me limp and wince during class, her eyes steady even as my father glared at her from across the room. Christopher admitted under oath that he had witnessed countless blows but stayed quiet out of fear, his voice cracking as he confessed what silence had cost us. My mother wept on the stand, caught between shame and loyalty, and though she tried to soften the edges, even her words painted a picture of a man who demanded obedience through terror. And then came my turn. Standing there facing him with the entire courtroom watching, I spoke not as the 15-year-old girl gasping on the carpet, but as the woman who had survived. I described the night of the chair, the words he spat at me, the years of gaslighting that tried to convince me I deserved it. My voice shook at first, but then grew stronger, carrying every scar, every sleepless night, every moment of fear transformed into truth. He tried to stare me down, but for the first time, I saw him shrink beneath my gaze. The verdict was not life in prison. It was not the grand punishment some might have wished for, but it was enough. He lost his standing, his community, his freedom for a time, and most of all, he lost the power to control the narrative. The world knew him now, not as a father or a leader, but as an abuser, and that truth would follow him until his last breath. In the aftermath, I built the life he swore I would never have. I finished school. I began working with organizations that helped survivors, and I shared my story with those who needed to know they were not alone. The scars on my back never vanished, the ache remained, but instead of weakness, they became a badge of endurance, a reminder that I had lived through the storm and stepped out stronger. My mother remained a shadow in my life, still tethered to her excuses, but I no longer needed her approval. Christopher apologized more times than I could count, and while forgiveness did not come easily, I saw in him the possibility of change, the proof that silence could be broken. And me, I learned that justice is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is about truth being louder than lies. Edward Bennett could never erase what he did because the evidence was written in my body and spoken in my voice. I carried the message forward. Silence protects abusers, but truth destroys them, and love is never violence. As I stood at a community event years later telling my story to a room filled with strangers who leaned in with wide eyes and quiet gasps, I realized I had finally reclaimed what he tried to take from me. He had tried to teach me fear, but I learned strength. He had tried to break me with a chair, but the MRI showed not just my injuries, it showed the undeniable proof that justice, though slow, always comes.